so everybody. So we can be sure to capture your comments in case we want to go back and review comments that are offered. We do not intend to post this recording publicly. Please keep yourself on mute when you are not speaking, and we'll monitor the noise levels. And if we need to mute anybody, we will, just to make it better for everybody involved. Please make space and take space for everyone who is making comments today. Each person will be allotted a maximum of 3 minutes to speak initially to ensure we're allowing everybody the opportunity to voice comments or ask questions. We encourage everyone to voice both their support as well as any concerns you may have with any of the information that we are providing today. And we thank everybody in advance for their good intentioned comments today. So I'll turn it over to Joe, who's going to basically take it away from here.
Okay, great. Thank you, Liz, for that good recap of Zoom etiquette. So let's go to the next slide. We have a hand raised. We can address that question now. Go ahead, Liz, if you want to address that question.
Is there somebody on the phone who wants a quick question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yes. We can hear you.
Thanks. I was wondering if a copy of the PowerPoint could be circulated in advance of the meeting or perhaps after?
Yes.
Yes, definitely.
Do you have an email address that you want to offer up right now and we can share it with you?
Sure. My email is rrebello@riag.ri.gov.
So, and your name is?
Rachel.
Okay. All right. We will get that off to you. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks
you so much. Appreciate it.
Of course. Okay. So hopping into our agenda here. To begin, I'll start with kind of just a brief background on the inventory, in case if no one is kind of familiar with what it is. It's important to Rhode Island's Act on Climate. I'll walk us through kind of a history of the 1990 baseline. We'll kind of recap why we're here today. I'll discuss some methodology updates, and we'll talk about the next steps, and I'll take questions to the best of my ability. Next slide. Okay, so we still have that hand raised. Do we need to, sorry, did we not answer your question? 908 on the phone?
Oh, sorry, I didn't click *9 to unraise it. My bad.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that we finished addressing your question.
Sorry.
No worries, thank you. Okay, so as you may know, we publish an annual assessment that details Rhode Island's climate warming emissions called the Rhode Island Greenhouse Gas Emissions Inventory. And our inventory accounts for greenhouse gases that are emitted within Rhode Island's borders. And that includes transportation, heating from residential, commercial, and industrial end uses, electricity consumption, industry, waste, natural gas distribution, agriculture, and land use. The inventory is the primary scientific tool for assessing the state's compliance with the 2020 Act on Climate's greenhouse gas emission reduction mandates. And specifically today, we'll be talking about the inventory's 1990 baseline, which is a critical data set that's used to benchmark our progress towards reducing emissions. Next slide. Okay, so to remind everyone, the Act on Climate has 4 greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements by mid-century: 10% below 1990 levels by 2020, 45% below by 2030, 80% below by 2040, and net zero emissions by 2050. So when the General Assembly crafted the Act on Climate, they chose 1990 as the baseline year, essentially the start year, to align with both national and international agreements to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. A scientifically sound baseline is essential for making sure that the state develops policies, legislation, and regulation that allows us to hit the mandates. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's start by talking about a little bit more about 1990's inventory specifically and kind of what's behind the numbers. So in 2013, the Northeast States for Coordinated Air Use Management, pronounced NESCOM, they compiled the first greenhouse gas inventory for Rhode Island. Through this contract, NESCOM also established the 1990 baseline, which was created using mainly default data from the Environmental Protection Agency's state inventory tool, otherwise known as SIT. NESCOM substituted some Rhode Island specific data into the 1990 baseline where possible. For example, instead of using SIT's default data for electricity consumption back in 1990, NESCOM developed their own methodology for this sector that used a Rhode Island specific emission factor. And for natural gas distribution, NESCOM actually used pipeline data directly from the U.S. Department of Transportation's Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, in conjunction with pipeline-specific emission factors found in CIT's natural gas and oil module. All other sectors, part of the 1990 baseline, including transportation and all the heating sectors, those were estimated with CIT default data. So 7 years ago, the state published the 2016 Rhode Island Greenhouse Gas Emissions Reduction Plan, which was the first comprehensive plan to mitigate climate change since the 2002 Greenhouse Gas Action Plan was developed. The 2016 plan made the first and the only adjustment to the 1990 baseline in the 10-year history of DEM's responsibility to compile the inventory. Specifically, the 2016 plan enhanced NESCOM's electricity sector estimate by accounting for the grid average electricity sector mix. If you're more interested in that, definitely point you to page 52 of the 2016 plan as of depth conversations outside the scope of this presentation. And the 2016 plan also added, for the first time, a land use change in forestry estimate to the inventory that specifically accounted the carbon sequestered by the state's forest only. And it's also important to kind of wrap up the history of the baseline, that the baseline has always used the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's global warming potentials from the second assessment report, which was published in 1995. And those are 100-year GWPs, but I'll get to that more in a second. Next slide, please. Okay, so after 7 years, it's time to update the 1990 baseline. Last December, the Rhode Island Executive Climate Change Coordinating Council, known as the EC4, approved the state's latest plan to guide climate change mitigation in Rhode Island. On page 32 of the 2022 update, the EC4 recommended further evaluation and discussion of updating the 1990 baseline if best science suggests new and reasonable parameters or methods. So since the 1990 baseline was last adjusted by the 2016 plan, the best science has changed and has developed new parameters and methods for accounting greenhouse gas emissions. And we're essentially here today to respond to this recommendation by the EC4 and also consistent stakeholder feedback regarding updating the 1990 baseline. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to hop into our proposed methodology updates, which do get pretty technical, so just ask everyone to save all their questions to the end. I promise we'll have lots of time. So the first improvement we're proposing is update the inventories at global warming potentials to essentially use contemporary climate science, specifically moving to the IPCC's 100-year AR5 global warming potential. And I'll elaborate on this more in a minute. And secondly, we're proposing to align the inventory's LULUCF sector, that's our land use estimate, with international reporting guidelines. And before we move on, I want to highlight that all other aspects of our current 1990 baseline will remain as is. This includes emissions from transportation, heating, and electricity consumption sectors. Since we're proposing to update the baseline using EPA's CIT, which is kind of our main tool for compiling the inventory, some emission factors have definitely changed since the baseline was developed 10 years ago. But adjusted base emission factors essentially reflect more up-to-date science and will help the baseline be a more apples-to-apples comparison with the most recent inventory. And additionally, we're proposing to apply relevant methodology updates, such as these, similar to the 1990 baseline on an as-needed basis in the future. This approach will align with how the EPA conducts the national inventory and how other New England states conduct their inventories. Next slide. Okay, so first let's do a little bit of level setting and we'll talk about exactly what a global warming potential is. So the global warming potential, often abbreviated as GWP, evaluates the climate impact 1 ton of methane, nitrous oxide, or ozone depleting substance has compared to carbon dioxide, which is the most common greenhouse gas. The GWP considers 2 physical factors: how much heat a greenhouse gas can trap, which some are much better at trapping heat than others. For example, methane and nitrous oxide trap a lot more heat than CO2, but thankfully are emitted in much smaller quantities. And the GWP also considers how long a greenhouse gas lives in the atmosphere. as some of them break down in others. And to reconcile this lifespan difference, GWPs are either expressed on a 100-year or a 20-year timescale. So since carbon dioxide is the most prevalent greenhouse gas and lasts for centuries in the atmosphere, the 100-year timescale is most often used. However, since methane is significantly more powerful greenhouse gas, GWPs can also be expressed on a 20-year timescale to demonstrate methane's greater climate impact. For example, methane is 28 times as powerful as CO2 on a 100-year timescale, but if we flip that and say on a 20-year timescale, methane is actually 84 times as powerful, and that's according to the 5th assessment report of the IPCC. Next slide, please. So every greenhouse gas has a GWP. Carbon dioxide is essentially always one since it's the reference gas. The list of GWPs is very long and expansive, mainly due to the wide variety of ozone-depleting substances from industrial activities. For the sake of time, just the 100-year versions of the most common greenhouse gases, CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide, are shown in this table between each assessment report. And as I previously mentioned, the IPCC, also known as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they're the United Nations body, so the world global body that sets and reevaluates GWPs through their assessment cycles every 6 to 7 years. GWPs change significantly between assessment cycles, don't change significantly between assessment cycles because climate science does improve as new data and methodologies become available. Next slide. Okay, so the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, also called the UNFCCC, specifically requires 100-year AR5 global warming potentials for nations that complete their greenhouse gas inventories. And this was decided upon at the last conference of the parties, also known as COP. That was COP27 that actually took place in Egypt last November. And the UNFCCC will require nations to use 100-year AR5 GWPs no later than December 31st, 2024 for their submittal. So the EPA's national inventory, called our Inventory of U.S. Greenhouse Gas Emissions and Sinks, which is submitted to the UNFCCC on behalf of the United States, it now has migrated to using 100-year AR5 GWPs. So to align with both international and national best practice, we are proposing to upgrade the entire Rhode Island greenhouse gas emissions inventory to 100-year AR5 GWPs. This includes the baseline and it includes all inventory years. Next slide. There are many benefits to upgrading the inventory to 100-year AR5 GWPs. As I mentioned, upgrading the baseline and all inventory years would follow EPA and UNFCCC's reporting guidelines, which DEM always strives to achieve. And if we use 100-year AR5 GWPs, it will replace a hodgepodge of different GWPs that are currently employed throughout our time series. So at the moment, all of our baseline and all of our greenhouse gas inventories through 2010 use GWPs from the IPCC's second assessment report, which was published in 1995, is pretty old by now. And our inventories 2011 all the way through 2019, which is what we published last year, currently use the IPCC's fourth assessment report, which was published in 2007. So adopting AR5 across the entire time series will essentially allow for a more apples to apples comparison across 3 decades of data. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears now. That was pretty much in a nutshell our proposal about GWPs. And I'm going to switch gears and talk about the second methodology update we're proposing, which involves the land use change and forestry sector, also known as LULUCF. It's quite a fun acronym. So as a reminder, the LULUCF sector covers Rhode Island's natural and working lands, and some states refer to this as their NWL sector. The IPCC, in their 2006 guidelines for national greenhouse gas inventories, Volume 4, Agriculture, Forestry, and Other Land Uses, actually defines 6 different categories of LULUCF. So we have forest lands, which are the most common in Rhode Island. We have croplands, grasslands, or wetlands, which include both inland wetlands and coastal wetlands, settlement lands, which is essentially urban areas, urban forests, anything that's developed, and another category called other land. Just to note that other land is actually classified as bare soil, rock, and ice. It's important that we in Rhode Island assume this to have a net carbon flux of 0 for simplicity. So you won't really hear me talk about other land. It's really all about these other 5. Next slide. So bouncing back to what our current baseline is, the current 1990 baseline was added by the 2016 Greenhouse Gas Emissions Reduction Plan, as previously mentioned. And the LULUCF estimate from the 2016 plan is actually an interpolated number, meaning that not all the data that was used to create the estimate is actually from 1990. The 2016 plan's estimate was derived from data provided by the Rhode Island Geographic Information System, also known as RIGIS. ABT Associates, that was the subcontractor for the LULUCF methodology, and also included trends found in EPA's SIT for carbon dynamics for forest lands. So the 2016 plan's estimate, which is in our baseline, only evaluated carbon sequestered by forest land, and it does not include any other LULUCF component. And in the past few years, we've tried to recreate this, but ultimately we've found the 2016 plan's methodology to be irreplicable and did not include LULUCF in the greenhouse gas inventory for a very long time. Fast forward to last year, with public input, we developed our own methodology using data from the U.S. Forest Service and DEM's Division of Agriculture and Forest Environment to estimate carbon sequestered from forest lands in Rhode Island. And our methodology for carbon sequestered on forest lands was combined with a very small amount of data on LULUCF from EPA's SIT that we felt confident enough for including in the greenhouse gas inventory. But it was 2019 only, so it was that inventory year only. Next slide, please. So back to our recommendations here, it's time for us to continue to improve our LULUCF accounting. The 2022 update was very receptive to our new methodology and included a recommendation to further improve this sector. So the EC4 recommended that DEM continue to collaborate with its Division of Agriculture and Forest Environment and the U.S. Climate Alliance to continuously improve the LULUCF sector. And in response to this recommendation, we continued to work with Agriculture and Forest Environment this year. And in April, I actually attended the U.S. Climate Alliance's Natural and Working Lands 2023 National Learning Lab in Washington, D.C., which was a great experience, and I got to learn a lot from experts specifically in the natural and working lands world, and a lot from my colleagues in other states as well. So Agriculture and Forest Environment was very helpful, and the Climate Alliance was as well in our journey to kind of improve LULUCF sector this year. So here's our proposal. Next slide. So building off success from the 2019 inventory, we're proposing to essentially fill in the gaps and align the LULUCF sector with all the land uses identified by the IPCC. This will be accomplished by leveraging newly published data by the EPA. Last year, EPA disaggregated the national greenhouse gas inventory by states for the first time, which is a pretty significant deal. It's important to note that EPA still recognized that the official inventories for states are still completed by states. But EPA's state-level disaggregation covered all sources and sinks of LULUCF as defined by the IPCC. So we propose to add the LULUCF sector categories that are shown in green on the right-hand column here. And this includes land converted to forest land, so that's regrowing forest, coastal wetlands, so both their net carbon flux and the small amount of land that is converted to coastal wetlands annually, very, very small in Rhode Island, and land that is also converted to settlements. So that represents any of the other categories, so forests, croplands, grasslands, etc., that is lost to development and thus converted to settlements. And this subsector is actually a net source of emissions since we're losing our sequestration. It's important to note two things with our proposal here. And the first is that the methodology that we adopted last year and put out for public comment and public input to estimate how much carbon sequestered from forest lands in the state will remain as is. We're going to continue to collaborate with the Division of Agriculture and Forest Environment to estimate the subsector's net carbon flux. And secondly, the subsectors that are shown up here, croplands and grasslands, notice they're not in green, and that's because they were actually included in our 2019 inventory. They were just under a different title, namely agricultural soil carbon flux. So EPA's state level disaggregation accurately split the agricultural soil carbon flux between croplands and grasslands, so we can nicely align with our IPCC categories. Next slide, please. So there are a few key benefits to updating our proposal behind the LULUCF sector. And our proposal both will follow national, so EPA, and international UNFCCC reporting guidelines, similar to our goal of updating the inventory's global warming potentials. And additionally, this is really important, this proposal generally follows the approach taken by our neighboring states, chiefly Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire in their greenhouse gas inventories. Additionally, adoption of this methodology improvement would add a net inventory total to each year, which is something we currently don't have and would be important for creating a more consistent time series. Specifically, instead of using two different methodologies, one for the current baseline and one for 2019 inventory, we would use one methodology across 30 years of data. That would be easy to tell trends in land use in Rhode Island. So our sensitivity analysis has shown that application of this improvement to the 1990 baseline adjusts its LULUCF sector from negative 0.29 million metric tons to negative 0.81 million metric tons, which is an estimate we believe is significantly closer to reality. Next slide, please. Okay, so to wrap up, let's conclude here. Our proposal to update the baseline in all years to AR5 100-year GWPs, it follows national and international practices, incorporates 21st century climate science into the inventory instead of using climate science from 1995. And it allows for a more apples to apples comparison across 30 years of data. And additionally, our proposal to align the baseline in all inventory years land use sector with the IPCC categories also follows best practice, importantly creates a net inventory total for each year, and also promotes consistency across our time series. So if these improvements are adopted, our 1990 baseline will be significantly more comparable to our 2020 inventory, which we are set to release at the end of this month. It's also important to note that our 2020 inventory officially assesses the first Act on Climate mandate. So it's very important for us to align it with the best science as possible and to have a best comparison to 1990 as possible. And I'm essentially going to end with this, is that the 1990 baseline should be recognized as a dynamic reference point that is subject to updated science and new methodologies. So to remind everyone, thus, we are proposing to apply relevant methodology updates to the 1990 baseline on an as-needed basis in the future, similar to EPA and other New England states. Next slide, please. Okay, so public comments on these methodology improvements will be accepted via our smart comment portal until Friday, October 6th at 4:00 p.m. So that's this Friday. And to read the technical summary on this, visit dem.ri.gov /GHG-inventory. Go to the quick links box at the top of the page and you can read it there. You can also find the link for smart comment in the same place. After the public comment period is ended, we'll consider any relevant feedback before the 2020 inventory is released the week of October 16th. And if these methodology improvements are adopted, the updated baseline will be released alongside the 2020 inventory and updated time series. Next question. Next slide, please. Okay, so essentially that's it for the presentation. My contact information is listed here. Feel free to call me or email me with questions after this listening session is over, but we have some time left. So let's open the floor for questions. Liz, anything you want to add before we open up for questions?
Before we jump into questions, and I see a couple of hands raised, I just wanted to offer that the information you offered up at the end there about where to find the smart comment link so people can offer up additional comments between now and Friday. I put in the chat, as well as the link you had there where people can go and they can find the full memo that was put out detailing exactly what you just talked about is also in the chat. So if people want to download those links, they are right there in the chat for their convenience.
Great. Thank you, Liz. Do you want to call on participants in the order that they raise their hands?
I see, I don't know the order, but I see Timmons' hands up. So
Okay,
why
we'll
don't
go
we
with
jump
that.
right to Timmons, and the floor is yours, Timmons.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Liz and Joe. I hope you guys are doing well and appreciate all the work. I already dumped a few things in the chat. I'm assuming everybody gets to see those, but I do want to emphasize the importance of this effort, and that the baseline is really important. I think I didn't realize it until having done this a few times, just how important the baseline stage is in the results you end up getting. So absolutely worth everybody's attention. The main things I wanted to point to is this study we did with Stockholm Environment Institute, where we reviewed the baseline methods used in the 2016 Climate Action Plan, which came under the precursor legislation, the Resilient Rhode Island Act, and redid all that in 2019. And the main points I guess I would bring up for this to be really rigorous is the treatment of methane, especially, and that is the leakage rates that are assumed especially from the distribution system. That is, we have some of the oldest natural gas pipes in the country. Similar studies in Boston found leakage rates of between 2.5% and 3.5%. We have very similar type pipes around here. So I don't know if you have, what rates in that document. I'm sorry, I haven't gotten to read the whole thing. So we should be using a rate, as we did in this, the revision that we did in 2019 of about 2.7%, but maybe the science has gotten even better since then. Certainly the monitoring by overflights and by street level, monitoring of methane leaks shows it's a lot higher. The second is, of course, this question of the global warming potential. And you talked a lot about the 100-year and sticking with that for apple-to-apple comparison. I think that is, unfortunately, is going to leave us in a worse position as the climate impacts are happening faster, and that the methane has a huge impact in the short term. And that's methane, people are saying, is a lot of the reason why a lot of our estimates of when the climate impacts were going to happen have been underestimating how bad it's going to be at certain levels of warming and the amount of warming that's happening in the short term. So I would urge the state of Rhode Island, and I know this may be a losing battle, but to consider at least reporting 20-year global warming potential impacts on our total sort of emissions of greenhouse gases. So the way you convert methane to carbon dioxide, please report it both ways, 100 and 20 years, and ideally actually switch to the 20-year. And then the third one is about production versus consumption based. I know in 2015, the state of Rhode Island issued a big energy report called Energy 2030 or something like that. It was a really exciting plan done by OER, Office of Energy Resources, and it used production-based emissions accounting, as has always been the case, that we always reported in production-based, and that's what all the treaties are based on, the Kyoto Protocol, the whole Paris Agreement and all that. That is, a country or a state can only control what's emitted in its state, and it's not adjusted for how much we actually consume in the state. If we're going to do consumption-based accounting, we really need to do it right. And if some indications are that it would really increase our emissions, that is, all the stuff that we consume that's produced other places in the world, if we accounted for all the carbon that was emitted where that fossil fuels were extracted, where they were burned, where the manufactured devices we use were actually manufactured, that our emissions would double, probably. So production-based is actually the area that we can control, our jurisdiction, and it's the way it's always been done. So I would encourage, us to consider those approaches. And I think that's my main thing. I'd also mentioned in the chat that the LULUCF, the land use thing, relies on the stability of vegetative communities, that is forests in the case of Rhode Island especially. There's many tons of carbon locked up in our forests. We're seeing with, for example, the beech tree nematode, all our beech trees are going to die in the next 5 or 6 years. That's going to release a lot of carbon. Sea level rise is going to wipe out a lot of our marshes. If we have forest fires like Canada, I mean, they didn't expect all those forests to be releasing carbon. And so a lot of that accounting is really problematic in terms of its assumptions about stability of ecosystems. And I'll shut up. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Timmons. I can address a couple of your concerns before we hop to the next question. On the first one, if I remember correctly, you were commenting about the natural gas distribution emission factors and how we factor that into greenhouse gas inventory.
Yeah, leakage rates.
Right, the leakage rates. Yep. So it's helpful that the 1990 baseline, when NESCOM actually conducted it for the first time, used at least pipeline-specific emission factors, however outdated they are. I believe they're still the same emission factors that we use today in EPA's state inventory tool. We've actually asked EPA to update the emission factors in the state inventory tool to align with the emission factors in the national greenhouse gas inventory. They're going to make that change next year. When we release the 2020 inventory, one of the things we're proposing is to, instead of going with kind of just one averaged emission factor across natural gas pipeline types, is to do a pipeline specific emission factor, similar to how the 1990 baseline is done right now. We recognize that the emission factors that are used in the inventory are from a 1996 gas research study. They are outdated. And that's why we asked EPA to at least align it with the national greenhouse gas inventory. As always, we're looking for feedback and way to improve the inventory, and especially in that manner. So, any more feedback you can provide would be great. On the second part about the global warming potentials, like I said in the presentation, we chose 100-year AR5 to really align with what EPA is doing and what UNFCCC requires. We can certainly evaluate, the amount of staff time it can be to report in 20-year as well. I don't know if that's going to happen before the inventory release, this October, but it's definitely something that can be done, and we'll certainly consider it for future inventory releases. And then the last thing was about land use. Remind me.
Yeah, production-based accounting versus consumption.
Right. Okay. Yes. Thank you. Yes, the production versus consumption-based accounting. I believe you're specifically referencing the electricity sector. So a number of years ago, the EC4 actually voted on having a consumption-based accounting for the electricity sector. So that way it is able to incorporate renewable energy certificates that are retired in Rhode Island to help us achieve the goals of the renewable energy standard. So there's a document on our website on the greenhouse gas page if you're interested in learning more about that. Let's go ahead and take another question. I think I saw Larry from Green Energy Consumers Alliance. Go ahead.
Larry had his hand up, followed by Christian, and then we'll go to Ben from Acadia.
Thank you, Liz and Joseph. I'm Larry Cretion with Green Energy Consumers Alliance. I want to support what Timmons said about changing the global warming potential for methane to something like 20 years. That's really where the science is. We all know that over a 20-year period, that the global warming potential of methane is much higher than over the 100-year period. You've stated a couple times that we're trying to align to EPA and to the United Nations, but you didn't substantiate why that makes sense even. I know that's alignment with them, but we're in a race here to try to get to net zero by 2050. Furthermore, we're in a race to get to, in Rhode Island, 45% below 1990 by 2030. We really shouldn't be accounting for any global warming potential after 2050 at all. So the relevant number actually is about 26 years is the appropriate figure. So we might as well use the one that's closest, which is the 20-year potential for methane. Now, there's a couple of reasons I would say that's important. We rather than aligning to EPA, the state of Rhode Island has to develop a plan and implement policies to get us to 45% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. And we want to do it in a way that economists would say is efficient and equitable. So what does that mean with respect to the global warming potential? When you know that the methane potential, the global warming potential of methane is about 80 times higher than carbon dioxide over a 20-year period, but yet you essentially forgive that by extending the period out to 100 years, you're essentially putting the thumb on the scale in the economy of Rhode Island. You're essentially saying that anyone who emits carbon dioxide, it could be an automobile, it could be a heating system that's fired by oil or propane, or a factory, it could be the usage of electricity. When we try to figure out the ways to mitigate carbon in those sectors, we're going to have to make them work a lot harder. We're going to have to impose a higher cost per ton of carbon dioxide to get to our goal, because we're ignoring the fact that the global warming potential of methane is so high. So that distorts the economy, and that will result in lower gross domestic product in Rhode Island because of you're choosing to align to the EPA. So there really isn't any economic justification for this whatsoever. Secondly, there's a fairness issue, as I'm pointing out, which is you're saying to some sectors, we're going to make them work harder than necessary because we're just ignoring this issue about methane over 20 years. So what I didn't hear is the real policy rationale. I might have heard you say, Joseph, that it's a matter of perhaps staff time in order to recalibrate to get to the 20-year global warming potential for methane. If that's the issue, we should just resolve that. Maybe that's where some of the EC4 money should go to get there. I'll go even further. This is an issue entirely about Rhode Island's natural gas consumption, right? The gas utility ought to be paying for whatever you need to get to that issue of, and I'm not sure if you could describe briefly what the barrier is to getting to 20, using that in your inventory. I think that would be helpful, because what I'm trying to say is we need to resolve this in time for the EC4 plan that's going to come out in 2025 to be solid, and so that we can figure out where we're going. And what I think it's going to, if you were to switch the time frame for methane to 20 years, you'd have an entirely different plan. It essentially would send a signal to all of us that we ought to be doing whatever we can to reduce gas leaks and reducing gas consumption and whatever else we can do. So the question back to you would be, what's the barrier to going to 20?
Okay,
Thank
you, Larry. Yeah, thank you for your comments. On a physical science basis, using 20-year GWPs makes more sense, right? Because it more accurately reflects the atmospheric lifespan of methane. There really, staff time, there really isn't a barrier to going to 20-year GWPs. I mean, it's a little bit, right? Because I have to do some recalculations of, inventory, specifically going back all the way to 1990. We now have 30 years of detailed greenhouse gas emissions in Rhode Island. But, Rhode Island's a subnational government. There's no, carbon accounting rules that sets what we have to do. We're always looking to align with EPA and what the UNFCCC is requiring, since they're able to deliberate and spend a lot more time than us on this. I agree that, if we were to use 20-year GWPs in the inventory, it would have a significant impact on the entire inventory. We would be looking at natural gas distribution subsector almost as large as, commercial or industrial heating. So it does change the game by using 20-year. If we, continue to receive, significant stakeholder feedback, like this going forward, it may have to be a decision made by the EC4. I'm not sure that, we have the authority to make that. May have to, have more of a public input on this since it changes the inventory so significantly. Did that answer your question, Larry? I want to make sure that, I covered what you were asking specifically.
It does. Thank you very much. And I can tell you this, we'll get other folks making comments very quickly. I forgot to add, just to point it out, New York State, I believe, has a 20-year time frame for the global warming potential for methane.
I believe New York and Maryland are the only two states in the United States that report that.
Yep. So let's be like them. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Larry. Let's go to Christian next.
Well, thank you so much. Unfortunately, I think at this point, I just need to echo the excellent comments that were made by Timmons and Larry, as they covered most of what I was going to say and many of the questions that I was going to ask. Yes, New York is currently using that 20-year greenhouse gas emissions estimate. They have been doing so for several years. And here I have to ask, which is more important? Is it more important to align our methodologies with other states, or is it more important to come up with the most effective reporting on the physical science basis so that we can most effectively combat the climate crisis and address our emissions? And I would have to argue that the answer to that is somewhat obvious. I do wonder in terms, but I think that all three of the points that Timmons made are very important. First, that a 20-year greenhouse gas emissions reporting timeline would be a better way to confront the crisis that we're dealing with, and a better, has a better basis, is more appropriate for this challenge. The second is that we need to be making sure that we use the best, most accurate estimates of methane leakage for our state, because this ultimately comes down to methane. And the third is the use of doing proper consumption-based accounting that accounts for the emissions that are the emissions elsewhere that are the results of our actions. And specifically, I'm wondering if RIDEM has ever looked at doing consumption-based accounting that accounts for the carbon emitted in the extraction, processing, and transport of fossil fuels to our state. Before you answer that, I just want to point out why this is important. It's important because we are not a producer of fossil fuels in Rhode Island. We're bringing in massive amounts of fossil fuels from other places. In the case of our natural gas system, we're bringing much of it in from the Marcellus Shale in Western Pennsylvania and West Virginia. And, there are emissions, significant methane emissions involved in the extraction and in the transport, as well as, for the petroleum that we're burning, there are also significant emissions involved in its extraction, its refining, and its transport. So I think that I'm wondering if there's ever been a consideration of at least trying to put some estimates on that so that our consumption really reflects the full life cycle of what it is that we're consuming.
Okay, thank you for your comments, Christian. On the first two points, to kind of answer, your question about consumption, versus production accounting on that, we really haven't looked at any detailed life cycle analysis regarding, natural gas specifically in Rhode Island. The electricity consumption sector is the only sector that really includes emissions imported from out of state. So this is kind of a larger conversation I think we'd need to have, since life cycle accounting is very time intrusive, and we would need to do more work around that, I think, to give you a better answer.
Okay, great. Yeah, I would just encourage. I wonder if there is a simplified form of that would not be as time intensive, but that could still begin to address the larger emissions that our consumption causes elsewhere in the world and in the United States.
Okay, thank you. Ben?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Thanks for the presentation. I had a few comments. So, I'd support what others said about, I think there's value in reporting both the 20-year GWP and the 100-year GWP, even if the official targets are tied to that 100-year GWP metric, just because I think there's value in showing both versions of the inventory. I also think there's value. This is more of like a kind of a communication point, but I think there's value in indicating that there are higher degrees of uncertainty in certain sectors than others when it comes to the GHG inventory. I think that's important information for policymakers to have. So, there's certain sectors like methane leaks from the gas distribution system or LUL UCF, right, where there's just higher degree of uncertainty. And, we know pretty precisely how many kWh of electricity the state consumes in a year. And then, Timmons mentioned in the chat that the LULUCF sector has shown a 7.2% reduction from 1990 to 2019. I want to just confirm that's using the old methodology for the LULUCF. And then my question, if that is using the old methodology, my question is, do you have kind of an initial estimate as in terms of how the LULUCF sector has changed from 1990 to 2019? I know you showed kind of both versions of the 1990 LULUCF methodology in the memo, but I didn't know if you had that like % change. And then my final question is, sorry, one more, and then I'll.
No, that's fine. Keep going.
And then my final question was around the electricity sector methodology. You mentioned that it was an EC4 vote that officially adopted the current methodology. Would that essentially, this is a kind of a process question, but would that require another EC4 vote to like change the electricity methodology again? I'm just trying to understand what that process would actually look like if it would happen. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Let me answer your first question about, sorry. Your first question was pertaining to land use and the 7.2% decrease. So that 7.2% is not a decrease between 1990 and 2019. That 7.2% is how much LULUCF offset 2019's gross emissions. So 2019's gross emissions, trying to rethink the exact number from last year's inventory, I think it was like 11.86 for gross emissions in 2019. LULUCF offset about 7% of the state's gross emissions to give us our net total. So if we take our new methodology that we're proposing this year for 1990, to 2019, we're looking at 1990 being around negative 0.81 and 2019, being in the ballpark under 0.7. So it's, still a little bit of a decrease, since 1990, mainly attributed to the state losing total number of forest acres since the 90s. So, does that answer your first question?
Yeah, that does. So basically slightly less negative emissions from LULUCF in 2019.
Correct. It could probably argued that LULUCF offset more of the 1990 baseline's emissions than LULUCF offset of 2019's emissions.
Got it.
Yep. And then the next question was about EC4 kind of vote on the consumption versus production methodology. So back in, I believe the year was 2016, when the EC4 voted to have the consumption-based methodology specifically for the electricity sector. That was before my time when I started here, right? That vote was taken. A memo was written on it too, which is available online. To change the electric sector methodology back from consumption to production, in theory, would warrant another EC4 vote to follow precedent for that. That said, we made an adjustment to our electricity sector methodology last year. That document is also available on our website. And that methodology adjustment last year specifically made it more transparent and more accurate for us to include renewable energy certificates in the inventory that are retired for compliance with the RES. I just wanted to echo and kind of remind everyone that if we went with a production-based accounting system for our electricity sector, we would have no method of showing the RES's effect on reducing our emissions in Rhode Island. So it's very important that we have a consumption-based methodology specifically for that sector. If it was a larger conversation about having consumption-based, for example, for the natural gas distribution sector, again, that would have to be kind of at a higher EC4 level to make those decisions.
I think on that particular question, there has to be an important distinction made. The EC4 did not adopt that policy by rule. It did not go through the APA and adopt it. It did it by a policy vote. It's a matter of policy, not rule. Hence, it can be amended by another vote without going through the APA. And so that it's an important concept, but it's not binding on anyone because it's not by rule. Let's be very, very clear. On the other hand, things like the state energy plan that was adopted by the State Planning Council is adopted by rule. Thus, the status of the documents becomes very, very important in giving general guidance. And what I'll note is this document, which I think is undergoing substantial improvement based on the discussions at hand, is basically internal state policy guidance. It doesn't have larger implications than that. Although those implications are major, it doesn't have larger implications. And that means it's not really useful to cities and towns and the public at large in figuring out what they should be doing. So it's a top-down reasoning without any legal applicability to the base of activity. So let's use the easy example of what should cities and towns be doing to conform their land use plans with the state's EC4 efforts. And that really right now rests on what happens at the State Planning Council level, not at the EC4 level. And what we really need to do is have things that feed into the system more broadly and are more useful from the ground up, as well as from the top down, and driving the EC4. And so this is commendable in many regards, but not terribly useful in other regards. And specifically, I think that we need to think of generationally, which we say, what does this generation do to do the right thing during its turn in the wheelhouse, right? And so, so how do we maximize the effectiveness of the current generation of actors is crucial. And I think that's more crucial than how we fit into global and national guidance. But how do we make give the maximum tools to the current generation in Rhode Island?
Thank you, Ken. That was really insightful. Yeah, Rhode Island's not we're a subnational government, essentially. There was back when in the 2016, when the EC4 voted, to adopt electricity consumption instead of electricity production. You're correct. That was a policy decision. That rule is not, written into regulation or statute or anything, official. Essentially, most decisions, all decisions around the inventory are made in a policy capacity as of right now. I think there needs to be a larger conversation, with the EC4 about making a larger framework for the inventory. We're serious about measuring our progress towards the Act on Climate mandates. There needs to be more of a serious accounting framework. And, at a national level, there's not any rules that says Rhode Island has to account greenhouse gases this way or this way. We're in some ways fortunate to have the freedom to do what we want in state, to tailor it to Rhode Island right now. But of course, we're always deferring to, EPA and international guidelines for lack of better knowledge. And, so if we were to, work more with the EC4 to develop kind of more of an official framework, for the inventory, I believe all these considerations could kind of be made and enshrined in that kind of a framework. But I think that's a larger conversation than outside of today. But thank you.
On the point of us being a subnational government, one of my areas of great experience and expertise is in federalism. And in fact, Rhode Island is a sovereign state. It is in that respect, within its own boundaries, in many ways, the sovereign entity. And we have to recognize that. And there are whole areas where we're seeing at the national government level active interest in paring back what the nation's doing. Active interest. And what we have to say is we have sovereignty in that broad, we're a sovereign entity. And there are areas where we can act independently of what the national government does. And I think it should be treated that this is as much a matter of sovereignty and explicitly revisit the implications of Article 1, Section 17 of the Constitution, which require us to be doing things that are beneficial to the current and future generation, right? That's specific in the Rhode Island Constitution. So let's, revisit that article of the Constitution as we think about how to design what we're doing now, and recognize that that is a real groundwork for effort, not what the feds are doing. The state can't do anything that violates its own constitution. And it needs to do the things required by the state constitution. That's a real foundation, not what's going on nationally.
Definitely. Thank you. It's definitely not my area of expertise, but I appreciate the feedback, and we'll work to incorporate that.
When this is over, go and take the 5 minutes it takes to read Article 1, Section 17, and say, aha, this is really an enormously valuable platform. GM was created in 1977. The Constitution was amended dealing with natural resources in 1986, and DEM has not been updated since the late 70s. The one effort to do it in 1990 went and then died after many years of not being implemented. So we are really a 1977 era creation, but we haven't really thought through things in the 1986 manner.
Definitely. Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments out there? Are there any questions in the chat, Liz? I haven't looked at the chat.
There aren't any necessarily even questions. We have some, hold on one second. Let me go back. I know you and Dina are having a problem seeing them. Aren't any questions? We have just some follow-up comments from Christian about thanking for taking his comments. The information that I put in there about how to access the smart comment document. And Timmons had his earlier comments shortly after we started about the baseline. So there's no questions that I'm seeing right now. If there is anybody else who would like to, we're basically coming right up on, we're at 12:01. I don't see any other hands raised. If there's anybody else who'd like to offer any comments, I would say do so now or forever hold, not forever, but at least hold your peace for now. And you can put your comments into the smart comment portal that we linked to in the chat. But I would just say for now, if there's anybody else who wants to jump in, if we don't see anybody else. Dina, maybe you can stop sharing your slides so we can see everybody else's faces, but I think we're in pretty good shape. Okay, there, that's what I was looking for. I don't see any other hands at this time.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Yeah, with that, comments will be accepted until this Friday at 4:00 p.m. Thank you everyone for coming, listening to us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.